The fog lay over the streets of Prague like a heavy veil as Commissioner Karel Hynek hurried to the crime scene. It was the early morning of March 15th, 1925, and the air was filled with moisture and the smell of coal smoke from factory chimneys. On the corner of Karlova and Shiroka streets, a crowd of onlookers had already gathered, trying to be dispersed by two policemen in dark uniforms. "Please let me through." Hynek made his way through the crowd and showed his badge. The policeman saluted and lifted the police tape. Behind it lay the body of a middle-aged man, dressed in a quality but somewhat worn-out suit. There was a bullet hole in his right temple. "What do we have?" Hynek asked the police photographer, who was documenting the crime scene. "Josef Procházka, 52 years old, owner of a jewelry store around the corner," the photographer replied without looking up from his camera. "He was found at 6 in the morning by a bakery apprentice who was opening the shop." Hynek bent over the body. Apart from the gunshot wound, there were no visible signs of struggle at first glance. In the jacket pocket, he found a wallet with identification and a large sum of money, which ruled out robbery as the motive. He carefully examined the bullet hole. It was regular, with a typical darkened edge from gunpowder. "Did you find the shell casing?" "Not yet, sir. We've searched the whole area." Hynek thought for a moment. Something about the scene didn't sit right with him. He scanned the surrounding buildings. Most of the windows were still shuttered, but he noticed a quick movement of a curtain in one of the first-floor windows. "Who lives there?" He pointed to the window. "A Mrs. Novakova, a widow. We've already spoken to her. She claims she neither heard nor saw anything." The commissioner sighed and pulled out a leather-bound notebook. He knew this would not be an easy case. In 15 years on the police force, he had seen many murders, but this one was different. The killer must have been a very skilled shooter. Hitting a person in the temple from a distance required considerable skill. "Where is the bakery apprentice?" he asked. "In the shop with his master, sir," one of the policemen replied. "He's very shaken, but we've already taken his statement." Hynek nodded and headed to the bakery. The bell above the door tinkled as he entered the fragrant room. An older man in a white apron stood behind the counter, and next to him crouched a 16-year-old boy with red eyes from crying. "Good day, Commissioner Hynek," he introduced himself. "I need to speak with your apprentice about what he saw this morning." The baker nodded and gently pushed the boy forward. "Speak, František. The commissioner won't harm you." The boy swallowed and began to speak with a trembling voice. "Like every morning, I went to open the shop at 5:30. As I walked around the corner, I noticed someone lying on the sidewalk. I thought it was a drunk who had spent the night there, but when I got closer—" His voice broke. "Go on," Hynek gently encouraged him. "I saw it was Mr. Procházka. I knew him. He occasionally came to us for bread. He was lying there strangely curled up and he had a hole in his head. I immediately ran back to the shop, and my master called the police." "Did you hear any noise at night? A gunshot?" The boy shook his head. "No, sir. I live upstairs above the shop, but I slept soundly." Hynek noted the statement in his notebook, and then turned to the baker. "And you didn't hear anything either?" "No way, sir. I bake at night. There's so much noise here that I wouldn't hear even a cannon shot. But I can tell you that Mr. Procházka was a decent man. I don't understand who could want to harm him." The commissioner thanked them for the information and returned to the crime scene. Meanwhile, the police doctor, Müder Vacha, Hynek's longtime friend and collaborator, had arrived. He had just finished the preliminary examination of the body. "So, what do you have for me, František?" Hynek asked. The doctor took off his glasses and began cleaning them with a handkerchief. It's interesting, Karl. The bullet hit the right temple at an angle of about 30 degrees downward. The entry wound is clean, regular, with a typical cutting canal. Based on the wound edges and the amount of gunpowder residue, I estimate the shooting distance to be more than 10 meters. That would correspond to a shot from one of the nearby windows, Hynek mused. Exactly. And one more thing. Based on the bullet entry, he must have been slightly bent over at the moment of the impact, as if he were looking at his watch. Hynek nodded. That could be important. He took out his own watch. It was 8:30. It was time to visit the jewelry store and talk to the victim's family. Mr. Procházka's shop was a neat establishment, with a brass sign and large display windows. Now they were covered with heavy curtains, but under normal circumstances, gold jewelry, watches, and other valuables were displayed there. Another policeman stood guard in front of the sealed door. "Where is Mrs. Procházkova?" Hynek asked him. "With the neighbors, sir. Mrs. Vesela took her in when she heard what happened." The neighboring house belonged to the well-known bookseller Vesely. His wife was renowned in the neighborhood for her charity and care for those in need. When Hynek rang the bell, he was greeted by a kind-faced lady in her 50s. "Commissioner Hynek," he introduced himself. "I need to speak with Mrs. Procházkova." Mrs. Vesela led him to the parlor, where a small woman in a black dress sat on the sofa. Her eyes were red from crying, but she held herself upright. Next to her sat a young girl, probably her daughter, judging by their resemblance. "Mrs. Procházkova, my condolences," Hynek began cautiously. "I know this is difficult for you, but I need to ask you a few questions." The woman nodded. "Ask, Commissioner. I want you to find the person who killed my husband." "When did you last see your husband?" "Last night when he was closing the shop. It was about 7 o'clock. He said he had some work to do, and would come home later." Her voice broke. "I waited for him, but he didn't come back. I thought he got held up by a customer, or at the Black Eagle pub where he occasionally went. When he didn't come even by 10, I started to worry. But what could I do? It was dark outside." "Did anyone know your husband would be coming back to the shop at night?" "I don't know. Maybe a customer? Josef had a few special orders he worked on in the evenings." "Can you be more specific?" Mrs. Procházkova looked at her daughter. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. "Here's my father's order book. He kept it very meticulously." Hynek took the notebook and began to browse through it. It mostly contained regular watch and jewelry repairs, but he was intrigued by the last 3 entries. 15th March, repair of Omega Gold Watch, Mr. Richter, urgent, 14.3. Čištění rodinného šperku, hraběnka Tunová, 13.3. Speciální objednávka, páně K. "Who is this Mr. K. Prime?" he asked. "I don't know," replied Mrs. Procházkova. "Josef didn't talk about some of his customers. He said discretion was very important in his line of work." Hynek noted the customers' names and then asked, "Did your husband have any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to harm him?" The woman shook her head, but the daughter suddenly straightened up. "Maybe Mr. Kuchera," she said quietly. "Be quiet, Helena," her mother snapped, but Hynek was alert. "Who is Mr. Kuchera?" "He owns a jewelry store on Wenceslas Square," Helena explained. "A month ago, he had an argument with my father. He accused him of stealing customers and using unfair practices. My father came home very upset." This was interesting information. Hynek noted this name as well, and then asked, "Have you noticed anything unusual lately? Anyone suspicious around the shop? Strange phone calls? Anything?" Mrs. Procházkova thought for a moment. "Actually, yes. Last week, I saw a man several times watching the shop from across the street. He was tall, well-dressed, with a hat. I thought he might be a new customer, but he never went inside. Can you describe him in more detail? He had a gray coat and a black hat, and a cane with a silver handle. I don't remember more. I always saw him only from a distance. Hynek carefully noted everything down. Then he looked around the parlor, and his gaze stopped at the large grandfather clock on the wall. Is that clock correct? Yes, Mrs. Vesela nodded. I wind it every day exactly according to the radio. It showed 9:15. That meant more than 3 hours had passed since the body was found. It was high time to start a thorough examination of the crime scene and surroundings. Thank you for your help, Hynek said, standing up. We'll certainly see each other again. And if you remember anything, here is my card. As he stepped out onto the street, the sun had already broken through the fog, and Prague was waking up to a regular workday. But for Commissioner Hynek, it was the beginning of one of the most complicated cases of his career. He returned to the crime scene where his men were already working. They were searching every inch of pavement and the adjacent buildings. The body had meanwhile been taken to the morgue, where an autopsy would be performed later. "Commissioner," called one of the officers, "we've found something." Hynek hurried to the young policeman, who was pointing at something in the gap between the cobblestones. It was a small brass object, a shell casing. "Excellent," Hynek praised him. "Carefully remove and secure it. This could be our first clue." When the officer carefully removed the shell casing with tweezers, Hynek examined it closely. It was a .38 caliber revolver casing, a fairly common type, but something about it caught his attention. There was an unusual mark on the base left by the firing pin. Hynek had been following the progress in foreign forensics for some time. He knew that in America and some European countries, they were beginning to use new methods of examining firearms. Every gun left characteristic marks on the casing and bullet, something like a fingerprint. If they managed to find the weapon, it would be possible to prove through microscopic comparison that this casing was fired from it. The problem was that no one in Prague had such equipment yet. Hynek knew of a comparison microscope in the police laboratory in Vienna, but transporting evidence across borders would be complicated and time-consuming. Perhaps it was time to convince his superiors of the need to modernize Prague's forensic science. "Commissioner," another officer interrupted his thoughts, "Mrs. Novakova would like to speak with you now. She says she remembered something." Hynek quickly climbed to the first floor of the building. Mrs. Novakova, a small, gray-haired woman, was already waiting for him at the door of her apartment. "Sorry I didn't tell you right away," she began nervously when they sat down in her tidy kitchen. "You know, I don't want any trouble, but I couldn't sleep all night, and my conscience won't let me." "Please, continue," Hynek gently encouraged her. "Last night, I couldn't sleep because of my rheumatism. It was past midnight when I heard footsteps on the street. I looked out the window and saw Mr. Procházka unlocking the shop. It wasn't unusual. He sometimes worked late into the night. But then," she paused, nervously wringing her hands. "What did you see?" "About half an hour later, I heard more footsteps. Someone was walking down the street towards the jewelry store. It was a man in a long coat. He stopped in front of the shop and stood there for a while. Then I saw a flash and heard a soft popping sound, like a whip crack, you know? Mr. Procházka came out, took 2 steps and fell to the ground." "Did you see where the shooter went?" "He ran across the street and disappeared into the passageway to Platnerska. He was running quite fast, limping on his right leg." That was valuable information. Hynek carefully noted everything down. "Could you describe the man?" "It was dusk, but he was tall, slim, and he had a hat and a cane with a silver handle. Hynek perked up. Mrs. Procházka had described the suspect exactly the same way. Why didn't you report it right away? Mrs. Novakova lowered her eyes. I was afraid. You know, 2 years ago, the merchant Weinberg was shot here. His neighbor, who testified in court, moved away afterward. They said he received threatening letters. I understand. But now we need your help to ensure justice is served for Mr. Procházka's murder. When Hynek returned to the street, his mind was racing. They had their first concrete clue, a man with a cane, limping on his right leg. This could narrow down the circle of suspects. But the motive? What was Procházka doing so late at night in the store? And what about that special order from the mysterious Mr. K? He decided to first check out the rival jeweler, Kuchera. Wenceslas Square was just a few minutes' walk away. On the way, he spotted a carriage and took it. Time was precious, and he felt like he was racing against it. Kuchera's jewelry store was much more luxurious than Mr. Procházka's shop. Large windows filled with sparkling jewels, marble-clad entrance, brass fittings. Above the entrance, a sign read, K. Kuchera and Son, jewelers and watchmakers since 1885. Inside, behind the counter, sat a stern-looking man of about 60. When he saw Hynek's badge, his eyebrows knit into a frown. Mr. Kuchera? Yes. What do you want? Commissioner Hynek, I'm investigating the murder of Josef Procházka. Kuchera turned pale. Procházka was murdered? When? Last night. Where were you between midnight and 1 o'clock in the morning? At home, of course, like every night. You can ask my wife and son. I heard you had a conflict with Mr. Procházka recently, Hynek continued. Kuchera sighed. Yes, we had professional disagreements. But that doesn't mean I murdered him. I'm a respected merchant, Commissioner. What exactly was the nature of your professional disagreement? The jeweler looked around the empty shop and lowered his voice. Procházka started taking on dubious orders. You know, in our field, discretion is important, but also purity. Some things just aren't done. Be more specific. A month ago, Baron Kolovrat came to me. He wanted to sell a family jewel, a rare sapphire necklace. Later, I saw the same jewel in Procházka's shop, but it wasn't the original. It was a copy. A perfect one, I admit, but a copy. Procházka started making forgeries. This was serious information. Forgery could be a motive for murder, if someone found out. Do you have any evidence? Unfortunately, no. Just my many years of experience. But ask Countess Thunova. She picked up a cleaned family jewel from him yesterday. I bet it's also a fake. Hynek remembered the entry in Procházka's notebook. Countess Thunova was the second to last order before his death. One more thing, Kuchera said, as Hynek was about to leave. Last week, I saw Procházka talking to a man in front of the shop. A tall, elegant type with a cane. It looked like an argument. Was the man limping? Kuchera thought for a moment. Yes, now that you mention it. He had something wrong with his right leg. Another piece of the puzzle. Hynek thanked him for the information and stepped out onto Wenceslas Square. The sun was already high in the sky, and the streets were filled with people hurrying about their business. None of them knew that a cold-blooded killer might be among them. The commissioner decided to visit the police archive. If someone in Prague was systematically making fake jewelry, there might be some records about it. And he also wanted to find out what exactly happened to that merchant Weinberg, whom Mrs. Novakova had mentioned. The archive was located on the ground floor of the police headquarters. Old archivist Kovacic greeted him like an old friend. "What are you looking for, Commissioner?" I need the file on the murder of the merchant Weinberg. It happened 2 years ago on Karlova Street. Kovacic thought for a moment. Weinberg? Wait, that was the case with the gold, right? They found him shot in his own shop. Exactly. The archivist disappeared among the high shelves and returned shortly with a dust-covered file. Here it is. But the case was never solved. Hynek began leafing through the file. Weinberg was a wealthy merchant who dealt in gold and precious metals. One morning, he was found dead in his shop. A gunshot wound to the head. The weapon was never found. Nothing was missing from the shop, so it wasn't a robbery. The main suspect was his business partner, but he had an airtight alibi. He was provably in Vienna at the time of the murder. What intrigued Hynek the most was the description of the gunshot wound, an entry wound to the right temple. The bullet fired at an angle from above, just like with Procházka. Can I borrow this file for a while? Of course, Commissioner. But what caught your interest? Possible connection to another case. By the way, do you have anything on jewelry forgery? Anything from the last 5 years? Kovacic dove back into the archive and returned with several files. Here, mostly minor cases. But 3 years ago, there was a big scandal with fake diamond necklaces. Some nobleman was involved back then, but it was all hushed up. Hynek took these files and settled at a table in the corner of the room. He spent the next hour carefully studying the documents. Gradually, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Someone in Prague was systematically producing perfect replicas of valuable jewelry. The originals disappeared without a trace, and the owners received copies. It was perfectly thought out. Most people only wore their jewelry on special occasions and didn't examine it closely when stored in a safe. By the time the fraud was discovered, it was already too late. And another interesting detail, in several cases, a certain Leopold Klein, a former jeweler, appeared as an expert. Klein lost his leg in the war and then made a living as a jewelry appraiser. Hynek quickly found his description. A tall, slim man, always elegantly dressed, walking with a cane with a silver handle. Now he was almost sure what had happened. Klein must have been the mastermind behind the whole operation. Procházka made the forgeries for him, maybe unknowingly at first, later knowingly. When problems arose, as in the case of Weinberg, or now with Baron Kolovrat, Klein solved the problem with a single shot from a revolver. But evidence? That would require a ballistic analysis. If we could find the murder weapon, microscopic comparison of the cartridge case could close the case. Hynek decided to visit Countess Thunova first. The Thun Hohenstein Palace in Malastrana was an impressive Baroque building overlooking the Vltava River. The commissioner was ushered into the reception salon where the countess, an elegant middle-aged lady with carefully styled graying hair, was already waiting. Commissioner Hynek? She raised an eyebrow. What brings you to me? I'm investigating the murder of the jeweler Procházka. Yesterday you picked up a piece of jewelry from him. Ah, yes. The family necklace from my grandmother. It needed cleaning. The countess stood up and walked over to the cabinet. Would you like to see it? She pulled out a velvet box from a drawer. Inside lay a beautiful necklace adorned with diamonds and sapphires. Even Hynek's untrained eye could recognize the master craftsmanship. May I? He extended his hand. As he examined the jewelry closely, he noticed a small detail. On the back of one of the stones was an almost invisible mark. It was similar to the mark he had seen in the forgery files, the hallmark of the original jeweler from Vienna. A beautiful piece, he said neutrally. Who recommended you to clean it? Mr. Klein. He is a very respected appraiser. He said Mr. Procházka is the only one in Prague with experience in such old jewelry. And how did you meet Mr. Klein? The Countess thought for a moment. It's been several years. He helped me appraise some family jewels for insurance. He is a very pleasant man, though, somewhat mysterious. What do you mean? He never talks about his past. All I know is that he lost his leg in the war, and that he has amazing knowledge of jewelry. He can identify every stone, every hallmark. He can even spot forgeries at first glance. That was ironic. Hynek took his leave and headed back to the police headquarters. On the way, he stopped by Procházka's jewelry store, where his men were already working. Did you find anything? Just the account books and some letters so far, reported Sergeant Marish. But there's something interesting in the workshop. In the back room was a jeweler's workspace, a bench with tools, a small forge, various chemicals, and in the corner, a sturdy safe. It's locked, Marish said. But listen to this. He tapped on the door. The sound was oddly hollow. Hynek smiled. A false wall? Exactly. But we need a locksmith to get in. Call 1 and search every nook and cranny of this workshop. There must be evidence of forgery here somewhere. Then he went to his office and wrote a report for the police director. He knew he would need his support for what he was planning. Director Novotny received him later that same day. He was a robust man with a mustache and a reputation as a progressive policeman who supported the modernization of the force. Tell me, Hynek, what have you got? The commissioner briefly outlined the case and his suspicions. Then he pulled out photos of the cartridge cases. This is our main piece of evidence, but we need a way to connect it to a specific weapon. Abroad, they are already using comparison microscopes, which cost as much as a new car, the director finished. You know our budget. But this isn't just one case. Look, the murder of Weinberg 2 years ago, now Procházka. And there are other unsolved cases, all revolving around counterfeit jewelry. If Klein is the head of the whole operation, we need irrefutable evidence. Novotny rubbed his chin. Go on. In Vienna, they have a fully equipped ballistic laboratory, but transporting evidence across borders is complicated and time-consuming. We need our own equipment. Modern crime requires modern investigative methods. And you think microscopic comparison of bullets and cartridge cases is the way? It's a start. Every gun leaves unique marks, like a fingerprint. With the proper equipment, we can catalog these marks, compare them, create a database. This is the future of criminology. The director was silent for a long time. Then he stood up and walked over to the window. You know what? Write me a detailed proposal. Budget, equipment, personnel, everything. And I'll try to push it through the ministry. But first, I want to see Klein behind bars. Thank you, Director. One more thing. I need a search warrant for Klein's home. You got it. But be careful. If he is the one behind these murders, he's a dangerous adversary. When Hynek returned to the jewelry store, the locksmith had already opened the safe. Behind the false wall, they found what the commissioner expected: tools for making fake hallmarks, chemicals for metal processing, and several unfinished forgeries. But the most interesting find was a small leather-bound notebook. It contained records of all the forgeries, dates, names, amounts, and notes on the original jewelry that disappeared without a trace. Klein must have had a fence somewhere who sold them abroad. "Commissioner!" A breathless constable burst into the room. "We just received word from our men. They were watching Klein's apartment. He just left with a large suitcase. It looks like he's planning to disappear." Hynek didn't hesitate for a second. "All patrols to the train station. and find out if there is a train to Vienna departing today. Prague's Wilson station was bustling with life, like any ordinary weekday. Under the high glass roof, smoke from the locomotives mingled with the voices of passengers and the shouts of porters. Commissioner Hynek stood at the entrance to the third platform, closely observing the passing travelers. Behind a pillar nearby, Sergeant Maresh was ready, with other policemen positioned throughout the hall. "The train to Vienna departs in 15 minutes from track 5, reported a young constable who had run over from the information desk. Hynek nodded. Klein must have known he was trapped. Nevertheless, or precisely because of this, he was now the most dangerous. A man capable of cold-bloodedly murdering at least 2 people would certainly not surrender without a fight. The crowd of passengers thickened. Mostly businessmen with briefcases and ladies in elegant travel outfits were arriving. And then Hynek spotted him. A tall figure in a gray coat, black hat, silver cane handle. Klein walked slowly, slightly favoring his right leg. In his left hand, he carried a heavy leather suitcase. The commissioner gave a discreet signal to his men and began to approach the suspect. Klein reached a bench on the platform and sat down. He appeared calm, even lighting a cigarette, but his eyes continuously scanned the surroundings. At that moment, several things happened at once. A woman dropped her luggage, which clattered onto the pavement. Klein turned sharply in that direction and saw Maresh stepping out from his hiding place. In the next instant, he sprang to his feet with surprising agility. His cane split with a single movement. It was actually a cane rifle, cleverly disguised. "Stop!" shouted Hynek, drawing his service revolver. "In the name of the law!" Passengers began to scream and scatter in all directions. Klein took advantage of the ensuing confusion and fired. The bullet embedded itself in the pillar right next to Hynek's head. The commissioner dove behind the nearest luggage cart. "Everyone out!" the policeman shouted, trying to get civilians to safety. Klein, meanwhile, jumped over the tracks and ran towards the locomotive of a freight train standing on the adjacent track. "Maresh, flank him from the right," ordered Hynek as he moved along the wagons. He knew Klein couldn't escape. All exits from the station were guarded. But he might attempt to take hostages or cause even more damage. Another shot rang out. This time, the bullet shattered the window of a wagon above Hynek's head. He ducked and pressed on. He heard Klein's footsteps. His metal prosthesis made a distinctive sound on the stone pavement. Suddenly, the sound stopped. Hynek crouched and cautiously peeked from behind the wagon. Klein stood by the water crane for refilling locomotives, his back to him. His cane rifle aimed at a young railway worker who raised his hands above his head. "Put down the weapon," Hynek said calmly but firmly. "It's over." Klein laughed. It was a cold, unpleasant sound. "Over? I don't think so, Commissioner. We're just getting started. Do you know how many more like Procházka or Weinberg there will be? People who get involved in my business and then start having second thoughts. Is that why you killed them? So they couldn't talk about the forgeries?" Procházka was a fool. He started threatening to tell the police everything, and he was making more money than he ever did in his miserable life before. Klein turned, still holding the railway worker in front of him as a shield. "Do you know how many jewels we've swapped? Dozens. And no one noticed. The originals are safely across the border, and their owners are proudly displaying perfect copies." Hynek saw Maresh slowly approaching from behind Klein. He needed to stall for a little longer. "And who is your partner in Vienna? Who sells the originals?" "You'll never find out." Klein smirked. "Just like you'll never prove that I killed anyone. Evidence? You have nothing." "You're wrong." Hynek took a step forward. We have a cartridge case from the Procházka murder scene, and soon we'll have microscopes that can match every bullet to a specific weapon. Science has advanced, Mr. Klein. The days of amateur killers are over. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Klein's eyes. For a split second, he loosened his grip on the hostage, and that was enough. Marish lunged forward and knocked the railway worker aside. Klein turned and pulled the trigger, but the weapon misfired. In the next moment, Hynek's shot hit him in the shoulder. The rifle fell to the pavement with a hollow metal sound. A second later, Klein's hat clattered beside it. And then it was all over. 2 hours later, Hynek was sitting in his office, writing a preliminary report. On the desk before him lay the dismantled cane rifle, a masterpiece of gunsmithing. The internal mechanism was modified to minimize noise when fired. This explained why no one heard the shots at night. "Commissioner?" Marish peeked in the door. "The director would like to speak with you. And one more thing. We found all the original jewels in Klein's suitcase, including Countess Thunova's necklace." Hynek nodded and stood up. The case was solved, but his work was just beginning. He had to convince his superiors that modern scientific methods were the future of criminology. And Klein had paradoxically provided him with the best arguments. As he walked down the corridor to the director's office, he thought of Procházka. He wasn't a bad person, just seduced by the promise of easy money. And he paid for it with his life. How many such cases could be solved faster, or even prevented, with the help of modern investigative methods? Director Novotny was already waiting for him. Newspapers with headlines about the dramatic arrest at the station spread out on his desk. "Sit down, Hynek," he gestured. "I read your preliminary report. Excellent work. And the idea of ballistic examination? I spoke with the ministers. They are willing to release funds for establishing a specialized laboratory." "That's great news, Director. But we will need someone to lead that department, someone who understands modern methods and can put them into practice." Novotny looked at Hynek meaningfully. "What do you say?" The commissioner thought for a moment. He loved fieldwork, the thrill of chasing criminals. But this was an opportunity to take Czech criminology a step further. "I accept, Director. But I have one condition. I want the first case of the new department to be a thorough ballistic analysis of Klein's rifle and the cartridges from both murders. We need irrefutable evidence." "I agree. And you know what? I'll invite the state prosecutor and judge to the demonstration of that expertise. Let them see that science can be as convincing as confessions or eyewitnesses." When Hynek returned home that evening, spring dusk already veiled Prague in soft twilight. On the corner of Karlova Street, he stopped and looked at the spot where Procházka's body had lain 2 days ago. Now, a young florist was packing up her last chrysanthemums. He pulled the cartridge case from his pocket, the one they found at the crime scene. Tomorrow, it would be placed under a microscope in the new laboratory for the first time. And perhaps that would mark the beginning of a new chapter in the history of Czech criminology. The first star rose above the city rooftops. Karel Hynek buttoned his coat and set off home. A lot of work awaited him. The basement room at the police headquarters wasn't large, but it sufficed for a start. The walls were freshly painted white, and on the long table lay a row of microscopes imported from Germany, cabinets filled with technical literature, and, most importantly, a brand-new comparison microscope, the pride of the newly established ballistics department. It was Monday, April 6, 1925, and Commissioner Hynek, now the head of the ballistics laboratory, was bent over the instrument. Under the lenses lay 2 cartridge cases, one found at Procházka's body, the other fired from Klein's rifle during test shooting. See for yourself, Mr. Prosecutor. He stepped back from the microscope and gestured to the tall man with glasses standing next to him. Dr. Václav Krasa was known for his meticulousness and skeptical approach to new methods. But now, as he looked through the eyepieces, his eyebrows shot up in surprise. "This is remarkable," he said after a while. "The grooves are exactly the same." "Exactly," Hynek nodded. "Every weapon leaves characteristic marks on the cartridge case. It's like a fingerprint, completely unique. Here you see the firing pin marks, the extractor grooves, and here," he pointed to a detailed photograph, "the tiny scratches caused by a defect in the barrel. They are identical on both cartridge cases." A young man in a white coat appeared in the doorway. It was Jindřich Bartoš, a recent graduate of technical studies, whom Hynek had hired as his assistant. "Commissioner, the results of the chemical analysis of the gunpowder from both samples have arrived. They are identical, a special low-smoke mixture. This corresponds to the testimony of the gunsmith who modified Klein's rifle." The prosecutor took off his glasses and began cleaning them with a handkerchief. It was his known habit when he was thinking. "All right, so what do we have? The cartridge case from the crime scene matches Klein's weapon. The same type of gunpowder. A witness who saw the shooter. Counterfeit jewelry found in his luggage. I think that will suffice even for the most skeptical judge." Hynek smiled. The first victory of scientific methods over traditional confession or witnesses. But he knew this was just the beginning. Requests for ballistic analysis from other police departments were already piling up on his desk. A week later, Hynek examined another cartridge case under the microscope. This time, it was a case of a shootout in Liban, where the body of a local businessman was found. Investigators had detained a suspect, a former employee who had threatened revenge for his dismissal. They found a .38 caliber revolver at his home. "This is strange," Hynek muttered to himself. "What did you find?" Bartoš asked, preparing samples for photography. "Take a look." Hynek stepped aside from the microscope. "What do you see?" The young assistant studied the sample for a while. "The marks are similar to those on the suspect's weapon, but not exactly the same. These grooves are wider, and this firing pin mark has a different shape." "Exactly. This cartridge case was fired from a different weapon. Our suspect might have a motive, but he is not the murderer." Bartoš whistled. "That won't be easy to explain to the investigators. They were so sure." "That's why we're here," Hynek shrugged. "Science must serve the truth, not preconceived theories." Later that day, he sent a report to the lead investigator. The suspect had to be released, and they had to start searching for another perpetrator. 2 days later, they found the real murder weapon. It was discarded in the bushes near the crime scene. It belonged to another former employee who took advantage of the situation and tried to pin the blame on his colleague. News of how modern scientific methods exonerated the innocent appeared in all Prague newspapers. Hynek received commendation from the director, and the laboratory obtained additional funds for equipment. But the greatest satisfaction for him was a letter from the wife of the exonerated man. "Thank you," she wrote, "for proving what my husband had been saying all along. Without your evidence, he might have ended up in prison for something he didn't do." As the successes grew, so did the prestige of the ballistics department. Hynek began training police officers from all over the country on how to properly handle firearms and cartridge cases. He created the first catalog of typical marks from various types of weapons, and most importantly, he built a database of all the examined cases. "This will be a revolution in criminology," he explained enthusiastically to Bartoš as they sorted through photographic documentation late one evening. In a few years, we'll have thousands of samples. When a cartridge case is found somewhere, we can compare it with the database and find out if the same weapon was used in another case. But that means archiving all cases, even those seemingly insignificant, Bartosz objected. Exactly. You never know when two unrelated events will connect. Remember Klein. If it weren't for the cartridge case from Procházka's murder, he might have escaped us. At that moment, someone knocked on the door. It was the night guard. Commissioner, we have an urgent case. A shooting in Karlin. 2 dead. The investigator requests immediate analysis of the found cartridge cases. Hynek stood up and put on his coat. Science knows no working hours, Jindřich. He smiled at his assistant. Let's get to it. As they walked through the night streets of Prague to the crime scene, he thought about how much the investigation of firearms had changed in just a month. Scientific evidence was no longer just an add-on to traditional methods. It had become an integral part of them. And this was just the beginning. In America, they were already experimenting with fingerprint analysis. And in Germany, they were developing new methods for examining blood and other traces. Science was opening new horizons for criminology. Perhaps the day will come, he thought, when no murderer will escape justice just because there are no witnesses. When every bullet, every cartridge case, every trace will be able to tell its story. A story that modern science can read. Rain drummed against the windows of the ballistics laboratory when a new case arrived in mid-May 1925. This time, it wasn't just an ordinary shooting, it was a series of seemingly random attacks that had been terrifying Prague for several weeks. Third victim this month, Inspector Kovács placed a folder with photographs on the table. Always the same pattern. Shot to the head from a long distance, no witnesses, no connection between the victims. Hynek flipped through the documentation. The first victim was a university professor, shot while walking his dog in Královská Obora in the evening. The second was a young bank clerk, hit on his way to work in Vinohrady. And now, industrialist Kaspar, who died in the garden of his villa in Bubenich. What connects them? Bartosz asked, looking over Hynek's shoulder. Nothing, exactly, Kovács answered frustratedly. They didn't move in the same circles, had no common acquaintances, not even lived in the same neighborhood. It's as if the shooter randomly chose his victims. Hynek took a cartridge case out of the envelope. This will be interesting. All three are of the same type. Winchester .306. That's not common ammunition. They spent the next hour comparing the cartridge cases under the microscope. The result was clear. All were fired from the same weapon. A repeating rifle with optics, Hynek said, as he studied photographs of the entry wounds. The shooter must be an excellent marksman. All hits are precise, from a distance of over 100 meters. Maybe a military sniper, Bartosz suggested. That would make sense. But why? What's his motive? At that moment, a young policeman burst into the laboratory. Commissioner, another shooting, this time in Letná. Hynek jumped up. The victim? That's the strange part. No one is dead. The shooter missed. The bullet ended up in the wall. And we have a witness. Half an hour later, they stood in Letná. The rain had stopped in the meantime, and a light mist was hovering over the wet streets. In front of house number 15 stood a man in his 40s, trembling despite the blanket the policeman had wrapped around his shoulders. Mr. Novotny! Hynek approached him. Can you tell us what happened? I was walking home from work. Suddenly, I heard a pop, and something whizzed past my head. Then a bang. That was the bullet hitting the wall. Did you see the shooter? No, but... The man hesitated. I heard a sound. A metal clink, like someone tripping over a manhole cover. It came from over there. He pointed towards the park. Hynek looked in that direction. The park in Letna provided a perfect view of the entire area. And from there, one could also see the locations of the previous shootings: Královská Obora, Vinohrady, and Bubenec. The key, he murmured. It must be somewhere around here. They spent the next few hours combing the park. They found the spot where the shot was fired, a depression under an old oak tree, with boot prints in the soft soil. And then Bartosz discovered something interesting, an old map of Prague, partially hidden in the bushes. It had circles and lines drawn on it. This is a military map, Hynek recognized, used for calculating ballistic trajectories. See these marks? These are the shooter's positions, and the circles. That's the range. When they studied the map in more detail, everything started to make sense. The shooter chose locations with a good view of the entire city. The victims weren't random. They were simply people who appeared in his line of sight at that moment. "It's like a game," Bartosz said, horrified. "He's hunting people, like at a shooting range." "Yes, but he made a mistake," Hynek replied. "That map, that paper." He pulled a magnifying glass from his pocket and carefully examined the edges of the map. "Look, this is special military paper, the kind used by the Austrian army during the war. And here," he pointed to an almost invisible stamp in the corner, "is the unit designation. Artillery Regiment number 28 inches Kovaz brightened up. That narrows down our suspects. We can check former members of the regiment who stayed in Prague." "And one more thing," added Hynek. "Did you notice that all the shootings occurred at dusk? Early morning or evening? That's no coincidence. Our shooter has a problem shooting in full daylight." "How do you know?" "Look at the last shot." Hynek pointed to the hole in the wall. "It's higher than the previous hits, and Mr. Novotny said he heard the shooter trip. That's not the behavior of an experienced sniper. Unless ... Unless what? Unless he has impaired vision, maybe as a result of a war injury. That's why he shoots mainly at dusk, when visibility is better for him." The investigation took a new direction. From military records, they identified 4 men who served in the 28th Regiment and had suffered eye injuries. One of them, Victor Malina, particularly caught their attention, a former artillery observer, expert in ballistic calculations. After the war, he was treated for impaired vision and, according to records, developed an obsession with precision shooting. "It's him," Hynek said, as he read Malina's file. "A man who lost normal sight, but gained the ability to perfectly evaluate distances and trajectories. In the dusk, he sees better than others. And the worst part, for him, this isn't a crime, but a mathematical problem. Every shot is just another ballistic calculation. Now they just needed to find Malina. And another scientific method helped with that: dactyloscopy. Fingerprints on the map matched Malina's military records. They tracked him down to an old apartment building in Žižkov. When the police unit surrounded the building, it was late afternoon. Hynek knew they had to act quickly. As it got darker, Malina would gain an advantage. "All surrounding positions are guarded," Kovaz reported. "He can't escape." But Malina had no intention of escaping. When they broke down the door of his apartment, they found him sitting at a table with a rifle laid out in front of him. Maps of Prague covered in numbers and calculations hung on the walls. And everywhere were photographs, hundreds of images of the city taken from various vantage points. "I knew you would come," he said calmly. His eyes, damaged by a grenade explosion, had a peculiar, milky appearance. "You found my map, didn't you?" "It's over, Malina," Hynek said. "We know everything about the regiment, your injury, the calculations." "Over?" Malina smiled. "This was just the beginning. Do you know what I've accomplished? I turned the entire city into one big shooting range. Every point, every angle, every trajectory. I had it all calculated. Perfect mathematics of death. But why? Why did you kill innocent people? Innocent. Melina laughed hoarsely. In the war, no one cared who was guilty or innocent. I was the best observer in the regiment. I could calculate the impact of every shot. Hundreds dead on my coordinates. And then the explosion came. It took my eyes, but gave me a new way of seeing. In the dusk, when others are blind, I see perfectly. Every shadow, every outline. The sound of policemen's footsteps echoed from the stairs outside. Melina must have heard them, but he didn't react. Instead, he picked up one of his calculations. Do you know that from this window, you can see exactly 26 potential targets? I have them all calculated. Distance, angle, weather conditions. That's enough, Hynek interrupted. You're under arrest for triple murder and attempted murder. As they led Melina away, he turned once more in the doorway. Study that rifle well, Commissioner. It's a masterpiece. I modified it myself. Every screw, every millimeter. Don't worry, Hynek replied. It will be in good hands in our laboratory. Autumn 1935. 10 years had passed since the founding of the first ballistics laboratory in Prague. Karel Hynek stood by the window of his office in the new wing of the police headquarters, watching the first snowflakes of the year. Behind him, a clock given to him by his colleagues for his 50th birthday ticked away. On the walls hung framed photographs. The first microscope, the original laboratory team. Newspaper articles about solved cases. On the shelf stood Klein's cane rifle and Melina's sniper rifle. Silent reminders of the cases that changed the face of Czech criminology. "Professor," came a voice from the door. It was Marie Kovařová, one of his students at the newly established police academy. "The lecture hall is ready." Hynek nodded. Today, he was to lecture on the development of forensic ballistics to a new class of cadets. As they walked down the corridor, they passed modern laboratories. Everywhere, technicians in white coats worked over microscopes and complex instruments. "When did you decide to start the police academy?" Marie asked as they descended the stairs. "It wasn't my idea," Hynek smiled. "But when we started with scientific methods, we realized we needed a new generation of policemen. Ones who understand not only law and criminology, but also physics, chemistry, biology." In the lecture hall, 30 young men and women, yes, women too, another change brought by the modernization of the force, were waiting. Hynek placed an old leather briefcase on the table and looked around the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "today we will talk about how science has changed crime investigation. You may have heard about the case of the blind shooter or the jeweler Procházka." Over the next hour, he told stories about the early days of ballistics research, the first cases, the doubts and obstacles they had to overcome. He spoke about cooperation with foreign laboratories, the introduction of new methods, and the creation of the first firearms database. But the most important change, he said, as the lecture neared its end, occurred in people's thinking. 10 years ago, a confession or a witness's testimony was enough to convict. Today, we demand evidence, scientific, irrefutable evidence. After the lecture, Jindřich Bartoš, his first assistant and now head of the chemical laboratory, was waiting for him in his office. "Do you remember our first case?" he asked with a smile. "How we struggled with that one microscope? And today?" Hynek gestured towards the modern equipment. "Spectrographs, X-rays, chromatographs. Technology has advanced by leaps and bounds, but the principle remains the same: to seek the truth using science." Bartosz placed fresh copies of the morning newspapers on the table. On the front page was an article about the arrest of an international counterfeiting gang yesterday. The key role was played by the analysis of the ammunition used in a shootout with the police. "By the way," Bartosz said, "did you know that Klein died?" Hynek looked up in surprise. "In prison?" "Yes, last week. But before he died, he wrote a letter. To you." He pulled an envelope from his briefcase. Hynek slowly opened it and began to read. "Dear Commissioner, when we met at the station 10 years ago, I said you had no evidence. I was wrong. Your scientific methods convicted me in a way I never thought possible. During my years in prison, I watched how criminology developed, and I must admit, you were right. The future belongs to science. Sincerely, Leopold Klein." Hynek slowly folded the letter. "Every crime leaves traces," he said quietly. "That's what I've learned over the years. You can be the smartest, but you can't cheat the laws of physics. Every bullet, every cartridge case, every fingerprint tells a story. You just have to know how to read it." Outside, it was slowly getting dark, and the snow was thickening. In the laboratories below, technicians were still working over their microscopes and instruments. Young cadets were studying the latest methods. And somewhere in the archives rested old cases, silent witnesses to the journey Czech criminology had taken. Hynek approached the window and looked out at the snow-covered Prague. In 10 years, much had changed. The city, the people, the technology. But the most important thing hadn't changed: the quest for justice and the belief in the power of scientific truth. He remembered his words from the first day in the laboratory. Science must serve the truth. Back then, it was a bold dream. Today, it was reality. A new device, the teleprinter, buzzed on the desk. Another case was waiting to be solved. Karel Hynek put on his coat and headed to the laboratory. The work of scientific criminology never ends,